So we're going to talk today a little bit about what good nutrition can do for you. It's basically a time for you to get revamped for the new year and get a little bit of a refresher course. Most of these things you guys, if you've come to my other classes, you probably know, but this is a good refresher just to kind of give you some more inside information to it as well. So what we're going to do is kind of break down each part of nutrition. One of those is carbohydrates. So anytime, who looks at nutrition labels? Yay, okay, good. So we know where total carbohydrates are listed on there, right? Well, first you have to understand total carbohydrates. They're made up of three things, and that is important because it changes whether or not you might pick your product, okay? They're made up of starch, sugar, and fiber. The only part of a carbohydrate that does not turn to sugar at the end of the day is the fiber, which is why we want you guys to get as much of that in as possible. If you're a woman, we want at least 25 grams a day. If you're a guy, we want at least 38 grams a day. Average American gets in about 10. So we don't do a great job of doing it. However, whenever you look at things like fruits that are naturally high in fiber, also naturally higher in sugar, we want to make sure that those are still things that we get in, because getting sugar from natural sources is a much better option than getting it from processed sources. So we still want to get as much of those in as possible, okay? So whenever it's broken down, the starch aspect of it, sometimes some manufacturing companies, they'll show total carbohydrates. You always have fiber, you always have sugar, but then sometimes they'll put other carbohydrates. Have you guys ever seen that on a label? Okay, that other carbohydrates, that's what they're talking about, is starch. Okay, it's just a molecule. It turns to sugar at the end of the day. So that is something that you do need to be aware of. But sugar that they list on there, your body just absorbs it, takes it in, and uses it for energy. That is why a lot of people will say, well, I feel hungrier after something that had a lot of sugar in it, even if, and it's about that sugar-carb ratio. So they're talking typically about pure sugar, what you just absorb, utilize, and burn very fast. Whereas starch takes time to get there, so typically people feel fuller off of those types of food for a longer period of time. So that's where some of those differences come into play at. Glucose is just another name for sugar. A lot of times you'll see that. And the difference between simple versus complex carbohydrates is what we were talking about with that main sugar being on there. So my rule of thumb for people is only a fourth of your total carbohydrates coming from pure sugar. So if your total carbohydrates on a nutrition label say 40 grams, let's say, then only 10 could be coming from pure sugar. The rest of it needs to either be coming from fiber or from other carbohydrate sources. Where you get into trouble with that is like granola bars. A lot of the times you purchase granola bars, they might be 25, 30 grams of total carbs, but 15 to 20 of them are pure sugar, especially some of your protein bars. Now they're getting better with protein bars about trying to cut back on the sugar, but has anyone tried raw protein powder? Taste it. It's disgusting. I don't recommend it. It's gross. But the reason it tastes so bad too is because it's pure protein. Well, then they put sugar in the bar or in the product to cover up that flavor. Well, by doing that, then we're increasing our simple sugars, and then that's where people start noticing if they're diabetic, blood sugar spiking. And then if you're not diabetic, sometimes people will say, well, I didn't feel as full after that, and it shocked me because it's a protein bar and I should feel fuller. Well, it might be the sugar ratio is different in that one versus something else, despite the fact that it might have 10, 15 grams of protein in there. So do keep that in mind, that you need to look at the difference between the two of those. So how much is too much? What I typically start people out with, because a lot of people come to me specifically for weight loss as well too, and the recommendation for women is 45 to 55 grams per meal. That's where we start diabetics. That's where we start anyone who's watching carbohydrate intake at all, because that is the recommendation for weight loss, and that is a good rule of thumb to try and get it as consistent as possible. Because even if you aren't trying to regulate blood sugars by any means, still having the same amount going in excess, anything in excess ends up having to do one of two things. Either your body has to figure out how to get it out, and it either does that through peeing it out or through feces, or it's going to store the extra in a fat cell, or it's going to turn it into triglycerides. You guys all got your Healthy Heights labs. So if your triglycerides are high, that's another way that we oftentimes see that happens because of overeating of certain food items. A lot of times sugar can be one of those that will end up turning to that excess fat that's just floating around in the bloodstream. So that's another way to kind of look at that. Men, we do 55 to 65. And then snacks, we try and stick around this 15, 30 gram range. Now, I get a lot of questions. Well, what warrants a snack? Should I have one? Is it better? Should I do mini meals? Should I do basic meals? Like, what should I be doing there? I always tell people it depends on your work schedule, number one, and how much time you are in between a meal. So if you're going longer than 4 to 5 hours in between eating, that warrants a snack. If you know, hey, it's going to be 7 hours to the next time I eat, or 8 hours, you need a snack in there, okay? So that's a good rule of thumb. Now, if you know in 4 to 5 hours I'm going to be eating my next meal, then you're good. You don't necessarily need that snack unless you legitimately feel hungry. Now, how do you know if I legitimately feel hungry? You always look at if you get a hunger signal. Hunger signal and thirst signals feel about the same. So I always tell people drink water, wait about 15 minutes. If you're still hungry, it's probably actually a food hunger. But if you're not hungry after that, then it was probably a thirst. And that's how your body's trying to tell you that, hey, I needed something else from there, okay? So this is what we were talking about, some of the simple carbohydrates, some examples. A lot of your candies, fruits fit into this category as well too. Any of your sugar drinks, anything that's going to be straight sugar going in the body. Gatorade, vitamin water, Powerade, all of those fit in that category too. Juice fits into that category. Whether you juice it yourself or whether you purchase the juice, it's still a simple carbohydrate. That doesn't mean that one isn't better than the other. It just means that it is a simple carbohydrate, which means you absorb it fast and you burn it fast. It's not going to stay on your body very long. Your complex carbohydrates, I bring up the anatomy of a grain mainly because a lot of people get confused with, okay, so if I'm watching carbs, a lot of times my whole grain products are actually higher in carbs than my white products or white breads. So what am I supposed to choose? If I'm supposed to have less of this, but yeah, I'm supposed to have a whole grain, I'm not understanding where's all that coming from. Well, white bread, what they do is this bran, this really thin little layer here, that is taken off through processing, okay? That's what makes it smooth and not gritty texture whenever you're looking at a wheat bread versus a white bread. Well, that bran is where all of your fiber is at. So you basically lose all of the fiber, and then that product, sometimes they'll try and put more back in, sometimes they won't. Well, the reason your whole grains are higher typically is because they have more fiber. And fiber is the only part of a carb that doesn't what? There we go, turn to sugar. Yes, so that we want that in there. So as far as a whole grain, that's why we send you to whole grains more often. Even though they're a little higher in carbs, I'd rather you be getting more from that fiber than anything else. Okay, so that's where we're looking at with this. Protein. So why do we need it? There is a lot of misconceptions that people want to go to really, really low carb and have maybe 20, 30 grams a day and then pack all of their nutrition with protein. Well, why is that bad? And why is it that big of a deal? Because protein does all these fabulous things for me. It regulates my blood sugars, creates antibodies so I don't get sick. It helps repair tissues and muscles. It protects my organs from visceral protein. So why would I not want more and more and more and more of it? Well, carbohydrates are your number one energy source. So if I don't have them, my body says, well, I got to figure out something else to do. I need a backup energy source. So instead of allowing protein to do all these fabulous things, it takes protein and converts it to sugar. And now I've made my own sugar because you never fed it to me. And that's where we get into a problem of all of a sudden, well, I took in all this great protein, but I'm not using it for what protein was supposed to be used for. I'm actually converting it to sugar. Typically, it will do that through breaking down some of your muscle. So I will actually see people who overdo protein and underdo carbs, they actually gain fat mass and lose muscle. Because of that fact, because your body takes that muscle, because all that muscle is amino acids and protein and fibers, so it breaks it down, takes those to the liver, converts them to sugar. Well, now I'm losing my muscle. I don't want to lose my muscle because that's what's supposed to be burning my fat off, right? Well, now we've got this problem and this imbalance because I threw everything out of whack because I didn't give my body what it needed. Okay, so that's why we want protein, but we also have to have carbohydrates to balance everything out as well too. Now, as far as muscle building with protein, we see the most success with getting about 30 grams of protein in at a time. Between 30 and 40, we don't see any different. You could go up to 40 grams of protein at one time. You're not going to really notice that you got more muscle out of it. Your body kind of views it as the same. So now I've got excess. Now I have two options again, just like I did with the carbohydrates. pee it out, because that's what protein, that's how we get it out of the body. It filters through our kidneys. Or I store it in a fat cell, which I also don't want to do. Okay? So again, getting in the amount of protein that you need, around 30 grams each time, is perfectly fine and acceptable, and we see the most muscle building at that point in time too. So we do try and make sure you get it after the workout though, because after the workout you have more success with building up the muscle after you've used it than you would like right before the workout. So we do try and get you to do it afterwards. So how much is too much? This is another question people ask. So where do I get started? What do I do? The basic rule of thumb that we can start with is if you take your current weight, divide it by 2.2, that's a starting place for you. That's where we can get you started. There's a bunch of other calculations that you can do, but usually for your calorie range too, we say about 25% of your total calories coming from protein. So that's another way to kind of figure it out. But if you take your weight, divide it by 2.2, that'll get you a starting place for a protein intake and where should you be at. I'll tell you, I either have one end of the spectrum or the other. Either people get in way too much or they don't get in near enough. Very few people are kind of right in the middle, getting in about where we want them to be at, because it's just not something you think about. Breakfast is the hardest for people to get in protein. You know, they're on the go, they're trying to get in just some type of food in general, and they're thinking, oh, let's grab some fruit, or oh, let's grab some nuts, or, you know, but they may get in 2 or 3 grams of protein, but to actually get significant protein in, they really struggle. Ways that we can do that: Greek yogurt, cottage cheese, eggs. Those are some other ways that we try and get that in as well too that you can utilize. They're going to have more protein than your nut butters or your nuts and seeds as well too. So as far as protein foods are concerned, like I said, the cottage cheese, a half a cup is 13 grams of protein. Huge protein to pack in quickly, especially in the morning. Put some fruit in with it as well too. A lot of people do that. The yogurt, try and go for the Greek yogurts as much as possible. Things like milk, nuts and seeds, and nut butters have protein, yes, but they're going to have 5 grams as opposed to Greek yogurt that has 13 to 15 grams. So it's a huge difference, and that's just where people get into trouble trying to figure out, well, how much do I get in without having this ginormous meal in the morning, because I don't have that much time. Okay? So this is what I was talking about, the high protein diets that can be very dangerous. Long-term effects, a lot of times, because people are going more towards meat and they go more towards red meat a lot of the times to get into some of that protein, we end up seeing that they have cardiovascular diseases. I've had a lot come back and they're like, I don't know what happened. My cholesterol's out the roof. I thought I was doing really, really good. I was eating all these things. I was losing all this weight. I was doing great. Well, it was the type of food that they were doing to get in their nutrition. And then we saw some of those aspects start to change there. Rapid weight loss, a lot of the times this happens because we're losing muscle and water. And I know that too we have an in-body over at Lift, and my patients who choose to do the in-body, it's not something I require them to do, but the ones who choose to do it, a lot of the times what I'll see is that their skeletal muscle mass significantly decreases over time from them doing that, just because of the fact that they were focusing more on protein. I mean, but they saw poundage lost on the scale. It's just the question of what kind are we losing, and are we losing the right kind. Usually loss of B vitamins, calcium, and potassium, just because of the fact that we aren't targeting those food items anymore that have those nutrients in there. We're targeting more of protein-based foods. And typically I see weights regained. That's pretty normal. As soon as they stop, they go back to, okay, well, I'm just going to try different ways. And all of a sudden they gain back 10 pounds or 15 pounds. And they're like, what happened? Well, number one, you're probably putting back some of it being muscle, which is what we wanted in the first place, but we're more concerned about that number on the scale than we are about fat versus muscle. So, this is to give you a little bit of an idea. Is anyone vegetarian? Or know anyone that's vegetarian? Everyone eats meat in here? Grandson's vegetarian. Okay, this is a concept to understand if you're vegan. If you eat no meat, how do you get in your protein? So I'll just go over this briefly. There's things called complete proteins and incomplete proteins. Complete proteins are animal-based, meaning I have all the amino acids needed to make a protein to build up my muscle and to get me what I need. Incomplete protein are ones that are plant-based sources. So if I eat no animal-based products whatsoever because I'm vegan, I have to know, well, how do I take these incomplete ones, because they all have what we call a limiting amino acid, meaning they're missing a piece of the puzzle to make a full protein. So now I have to figure out, well, which foods do I put together because they have the other piece that that food doesn't have. So that's where that comes into play as far as trying to make sure you're getting complete proteins. This will help you to know which ones to kind of put together and see there. But fat, this is another one. I have a lot of people who say, I won't eat fat because it makes me fat. I promise that is not always the case. It all depends on what kind of fat you're eating and how much you're eating of it. So to break it down, these are some of the fats that we look at. Monounsaturated and poly, they are not required to be listed on a nutrition label. That does not mean that they don't exist, okay? FDA regulates that only saturated and trans fat have to be on that nutrition label, but all 4 of those fats make up that total number whenever you look at total fat. So how you figure that out, if I have my total fat is 12 grams of fat, my saturated it says is 3, and my trans is 3. Well, that's only 6 of my 12. So that tells you the other 6 are coming from mono and polyunsaturated fatty acids. So that's how it can tip you off, hey, some of that exists in there. But those are the 2 that we want you to have more of, and no one gets typically enough of it. Where you're going to find those typically is going to be your nuts and your seeds, your avocados, your oils. That's where you're going to find them the most. Now, that does not mean that you will not find them in other food products. You will. Any of your other boxed foods or processed foods, they still have some of those in there. But those sources are going to be your absolute best sources. And saturated fat, you need it to survive. Don't think that I can just have none for the rest of my life and call it good. And then that way I'll never have high cholesterol, I'll never have problems with triglycerides. Not true. Saturated fat is required for survival. So you have to have some. We just do like what we do with everything else, and we have way too much. So we've got to monitor that as much as possible. So on a nutrition label, that's one that we really want to look at, trying to get 3 grams or less per serving. That's a good rule of thumb to try and help regulate and make sure you don't overdo at that point. Trans fat, those are the ones that we don't want any of. It's man-made. We did it. Manufacturing companies said, hey, I can make this fat that's super cheap. It's a great filler for all of the foods, and I can charge you more money and make more of a profit because it didn't cost me very much to make it. So that's how it came about and it existed. Well, then they found out, hey, it's creating heart disease. So now we need to try and back it out of our foods as much as possible. So now that's why you're seeing more trans fat free or no trans fat added, or trying to look at those types of things. So on fat, how much is too much? This is what I tell everyone. You can do the calculations and count your individual grams. My rule of thumb is if your nutrition label says 3 grams or less per serving on saturated, trans it says 0, I'm good with where the rest of it's coming from. So if it says 25 grams of fat, but only 3 is saturated, 0 is coming from trans, the rest is coming from good fats, I'm fine with that. It helps make you feel full. It actually helps lower your cholesterol and your triglycerides and keep you healthier. And I've yet to see someone gain weight off of that because they usually don't eat enough of it anyways. Okay? So monounsaturated is our gold standard fat. It's the one that we want the most of because it actually will slightly increase our HDL and decrease our LDL. Now you guys got all your lab work, so you know how your numbers are changing. HDL is one that a lot of people struggle to get up. Food is not the number one way you are going to increase your HDL. Number one way you're going to do it is exercise. And that's just always been the rule of thumb. A good example of that is I had a boss a few years ago who, she was an avid runner. Terrible with her diet, and she'd tell you that straight up. But because she was an avid runner, her HDL was 90. All of her other numbers were out of whack, and her cholesterol was high, triglycerides were high, but her HDL was 90 just because she made sure that she exercised no matter what went into her body. Okay, so it does help, it does work, and that's something that you do need to look at. Polyunsaturated, we tend to get plenty of poly. It's the mono that we don't see as much going in on. Polyunsaturated has a couple of different kinds of fat in it, omega-3s, omega-6s, omega-9s. Omega-3s are the big one that everyone knows about because we get in plenty of omega-6s and 9s, we just don't get enough of omega-3s. Because omega-3s, you really find them in nuts and seeds, you find them in some of your oils, and then you find them in fish. Those are your best sources. Omega-6s you're going to find in all of your processed foods and your breads and your whole grains and things like that. That's where those omegas are coming from. So we tend to get enough of those. It's that we get an imbalance, though, between the 3s. So these are some good sources of it, but this will help lower your LDL, but it can slightly decrease HDL if we overdo it. Okay, so that's why we want to make sure we still get in those good mono too. And saturated fat, you guys know what this is. It's the kind that we don't want in there. Now, as far as butter is concerned, I will tell you, I would rather you eat real butter sparingly than I would you ever touch margarine. Okay, margarine is full of toxins, and it typically does not break down well in the body, and it's actually a man-made product. There's very little natural product in margarine by itself. So we usually recommend have real butter, just have it as sparingly as possible. The coconut oil, does anyone use coconut oil? We got a few in here. Okay, coconut oil, actually, a lot of people got nervous about it because it is high in saturated fat and it is a solid fat. However, they found out through research that it's mostly made up of what we call MCTs, or medium chain triglycerides. And MCT oils we've actually seen to lower heart disease risk, help with dementia. So we actually recommend that people do the coconut oil even though it's high in saturated fat because of the type that it is. So that is something that I would highly recommend. If you've never tried it, try it. I don't notice the coconut flavor in my food. Some of my family say that they do on things like eggs. If they're cooking them in a pan, you know, I got a head shaking back there, yeah. So just depending on what you're putting it in, you might notice a little bit of a taste, but most of the things that I put it in, I don't notice it very much. Trans fat, like we were talking about, basically what trans fat is we took unsaturated fat, which is what we like, those mono and those poly, and we saturated it. And they broke it down and made it into something that was a bad fat. So that's why we want to get it out of the system as much as possible. There's absolutely no benefit to it. It decreases HDL, increases LDL. It causes nothing good for our body. So we try and get it out as much as possible. Cholesterol. Cholesterol itself, your body recognizes dietary cholesterol as that, cholesterol. Your body will make every bit of cholesterol you need if you ingest none of it. And if you ingest some, it will cut back on it. So whenever we look at dietary cholesterol, it's not typically what raises cholesterol numbers. So I don't have people look at it as much as I do saturated or trans fat, because we won't see a huge results from decreasing that a whole lot compared to the saturated and trans if our cholesterol numbers are out of whack or our triglycerides are out of whack. Triglycerides, this is the fat that's floating in the bloodstream. And like I said, the trans fat and the saturated fat will increase it. However, overconsumption of food, carbohydrates, protein, all of that can increase it as well too. Specifically a lot of sweets, fried foods, things like that. Those are going to be things that are going to contribute to it the quickest because of how it's converted into that fat. And again, it's that fat that floats in the bloodstream. It weighs down your blood. Well, if I've got fat floating, weighing down my blood, and I've got cholesterol attached to my arteries, making them smaller, both of them together make it where I can't get my blood through. Therefore, we need a stent, we have a heart attack, we have a stroke, we have any of those problems. So it is important to still watch that and make sure that we're keeping that down. Even if your cholesterol is good, you really got to try and keep down your triglycerides as well too. What questions do you guys have over that or anything else? Anything at all? Okay. Well, thank you guys so much for coming. Enjoy your Christmas.